The First World War begins in Europe, but arguably the beginning of its end doesn't start with Europe. It starts half a world away in the United States. So in 1912, Democrat Woodrow Wilson is elected President of the United States, and he famously declares that it would be the irony of fate if my administration had to contend chiefly with foreign affairs. Well, as it turns out, there will be a tremendous irony of fate here. But the fact is that Woodrow Wilson was not particularly partial towards either the Allies or the Central Powers when war breaks out in 1914. In fact, he famously says that Americans should be neutral in thought as well as in deed. However, regardless as to whether or not Americans were neutral in their thoughts and deeds, they weren't neutral as far as their wallets and pocketbooks were concerned. They sold food, weapons, and gave loans to the Entente to an exponentially greater degree than they did to the Central Powers. So what happens is, in an effort to isolate Britain and cut it off from overseas supply, the German government implements a policy of what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, in which neutral ships that seem to be bound for an allied port, either Britain or France, are going to be attacked without notice. Note that this could lead to the German government coming to blows with potentially any government that trades with either Britain, France, or Russia. This turns out to be a pretty bad look because in 1915, a German U-boat sinks a British luxury liner, the Lusitania, in which approximately 120 or so Americans end up dying. The Germans argue that the Lusitania had secret shipments of arms and munitions. Britain denies it. Later is proven true, but the fact remains is that Germany torpedoes what is, for all intents and purposes, a cruise ship. So unrestricted warfare is a really bad look for the Germans. They try it for a little bit. Then the United States ends up lodging a fairly vocal protest before the German government. The German government briefly sort of pulls back unrestricted submarine warfare, but they also recognize that this is probably the best shot they have to cut Britain, an island nation, off by sea. And if they can cut Britain off, what they reason is they can basically paralyze the entire Allied powers. So eventually, they roll back unrestricted submarine warfare, and what the German government realizes is that will inevitably bring the United States into war. Now, the German government at this time is basically run by the military. Like, the emperor is still in charge, at least theoretically, but really day-to-day affairs are governed by the generals. And the generals obviously view things from through a purely military perspective. And what the generals are thinking is, well, the United States has a pretty big economy, but it doesn't really matter because the American army is really small. And by the way, that's totally true. The U.S. Army only numbered about 200,000 to 300,000 troops. To give you guys an idea, twice as many people were killed, wounded, or captured in the Battle of Verdun or the Battle of the Somme than were in the entire U.S. Army. So the United States didn't really rate as a military power. So the Germans were thinking that if the United States gets involved in World War I, it's not really going to matter at the end of the day, because by the time the Americans get involved, the war is more or less already going to be over. Note that the Germans basically make the same assumption with the United States that they do with Britain during the early days of the war. So if the Americans are going to come in, well, the idea is they need to be distracted. So the German Foreign Secretary, a guy by the name of Alfred Zimmermann, sends a telegram to the government of Mexico in which it promises to recognize basically all the territory that Mexico lost in the Mexican-American War as Mexican if Mexico basically declares war on the United States. So keep in mind, by the way, that at this point in time, Mexico is in the middle of a civil war. It's got a lot on its hands already that doesn't involve invading the largest industrial power on planet Earth. But Great Britain intercepts that telegram and gleefully shows that to the Americans, showing that the Germans are untrustworthy. And so slowly but surely, there is a buildup towards war until in April 1917, Woodrow Wilson goes to Congress, asks for a declaration of war, and Congress gives him that. Everybody knows that with the large size of the American economy and the American population, America coming into the war is going to be very decisive. But again, America is utterly unprepared for war. Its army is very, very small. Its military industrial base doesn't really, well, it still doesn't really exist. It's basically producing mostly civilian consumer goods at this point. So, in other words, it's going to take a hot minute for the United States to actually get in the game. Now, America's declaration of war at the time was seen as very controversial and arguably is still seen in some quarters as being controversial. There wasn't a clear Pearl Harbor moment. There wasn't a clear moment where the United States wakes up and realizes that it's under attack and it's in dire jeopardy. Again, you just don't have that moment in World War I. You have this slow sort of push to war, but there's not that decisive moment where Americans feel that their safety is in jeopardy. What this means is that governments, not just the United States, but all governments have to make sure that they manage their home fronts and the morale back home just as much as they do the actual battlefront. This is particularly the case because World War I is a total war, which means that governments are going to have to mobilize basically everybody in order to achieve final victory. In a total war, by the way, this even includes people whom the government usually treats like garbage. So like in the United States, it means whereas normally black and people of color in the American South especially have to live under Jim Crow, now they're being conscripted into the military. And in many cases, some of these black troops are considered some of the best troops in the United States Army. They're needed to actually win. And so the governments in World War I have to kind of alter their approach there. By the way, that's going to become very important when we talk about women and their participation on the home front. But anyway, in a total war, the results of individual battles matter less than, for example, the fighting spirit or the morale back home. Now, we've got to say, there is a lot that would depress the fighting spirit, both at home and on the front. So soldiers felt that they were unsupported and that citizens lacked commitment for or understanding of the war. But in fairness, lots of soldiers themselves didn't understand what the war it was for exactly. Remember, this is the time period where, as Blackadder famously put it, Archduke shot an ostrich, and that's why the war broke out. Like World War I was just as hard to explain to people at the time as it is to explain to people today. So governments rely upon propaganda to simplify matters. So, for example, Germany's not the enemy because they declare war alongside Austria-Hungary. They're the enemy because they're really mean and nasty and brutish and barbaric, that kind of thing. They kill Belgian people, and they're guilty of all sorts of atrocities. So we also have to remember that beyond the war, there's all kinds of problems that governments, are having to manage. Like, for example, in 1918, you have the outbreak, the worldwide outbreak of what is called the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu ends up killing nearly as many people as World War I itself. In fact, some people argue that it kills even more people. World War I kills about 18 million or so people. The Spanish flu, I've heard estimates that state that it kills roughly 20 million people. So, in other words, there's a lot going on that could easily depress civilian morale. And if civilian morale is crushed, well, maybe they're not going to go to work in factories and produce the weapons and material necessary to fight the war. And if they're not going to do that, then it's game over. To sort of prevent that, in many cases, governments took over entire industries to make sure they were optimized for wartime production. Um, and you get these bizarre situations. So nationalizing an industry is something that we generally associate more with like socialist or communist governments, right? Because remember that in a socialist economy, the state controls the means of production, controls the things that produce wealth, ergo, like factories. So if there was a country that wasn't particularly socialist and actually was deathly afraid of socialism before World War One, it was Germany. But ironically, Germany adopts what is called wartime socialism, in which the government steps in and manages vast numbers of industries, not because it becomes genuinely socialist, but because it needs to streamline production for wartime necessities. So, in many cases, the fact that people who are ordinarily shunned are being employed by factories means that they're benefiting by the war itself. One example of this is the fact that large numbers of women across the world are employed in factories, and this is actually one of the reasons why after World War One, in many countries around the world, women are given the right to vote. Believe it or not, now we basically come to the end of the war. So remember in 1917, Russia has to withdraw. This allows Germany to basically bring most of its troops from the east back to the west. So the Germans have more troops, but the Allies also have more troops because remember, the Americans have declared war, and now hundreds of thousands and soon millions of American troops will be in France fighting the German army. So Germany has to do something decisive to potentially break the stalemate. So the Germans come up with a plan to try to break the stalemate of the Western Front. They train large numbers of specialized stormtrooper units that are supposed to assault the British, the French, and the American lines, break through, and allow for, once again, possibly a push on Paris. So they unleash their offensive. This is in the middle of 1918, as the American army is actually getting its, feet on the ground. And at first, the Germans are very, very successful. They push the Allies back considerably, but they're not successful enough. The Germans end up losing all of their best troops and take mounting losses. So what happens after that is the German government authorizes a last-ditch effort by the German Navy to try to break through the British blockade so that way the Germans can get supplies from their colonies. Well, the German sailors aren't stupid. They know the Royal Navy outnumbers them and outclasses them to an overwhelming degree, and they know that this is a suicide mission. So basically all these sailors go on strike. Now, you got to understand that German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II loves his navy. He kind of almost views them as like his own, like kind of like his toy soldier collection. And so when he hears that his beloved navy has gone on strike, he hesitates. He doesn't want to send the troops after the sailors to like execute them and that kind of thing because like they're tight, So he hesitates, and that hesitation leads to other strikes, especially from left-wing socialist anarchist groups to spring up all throughout Germany. Basically, Germany grinds to a halt. German industry, the German war effort, and the German emperor is told by his commanders that the army will not fight for him. So, after you have the abdication of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, you also have a situation where German commanders have to basically agree to the inevitable. They agree that there will be an armistice on November 11th, 1918. So that is the end of World War I, where you have a conflict that claims roughly 15 million lives, wounds about 20 million more, and that's not even taking into account injuries that we know exist today but are hard to quantify, like, for example, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Um, so you have the elimination of, in many cases, an entire generation of young men, and you have cities, towns, and entire regions that are basically destroyed and have basically become enormous craters. Um, so that is the end of World War One. Now, as horrible as war is, the actual business of war is pretty straightforward. You destroy the enemy and make the enemy cry uncle and do what you want. You do that by basically applying coercive power, force, sometimes lethal force to make the enemy do what you want. So war in that respect is very, very straightforward. What's not as straightforward is coming up with a peace agreement to prevent a similar war from ever happening again. And that is what we will talk about next time at Versailles.